Hello, and welcome to our children's message today. And what you see before you right now are mustard seeds. They look really, well, it's hard to tell how little they are. I put them on a piece of paper. I'll kind of show you. I'm going to put my hand here next to them. You can kind of see how little they are compared to my hand. If I can pick one up, see if the camera can focus on this one. One little one in my hand there, you can probably see it. It's kind of tough for the camera to focus on that because it's so small. That's a mustard seed. And Jesus talks about mustard seeds today. He talks about how a mustard seed, when it's planted in the ground, even though it's the tiniest of all the seeds, it becomes this huge plant where even birds of the air can nest and can stay in it. And he's talking about that seed of faith that's planted in us. There's a couple of times that Jesus talks about mustard seeds, and he says, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, so look at those tiny seeds. I'm going to give you an idea here. I'm going to back the camera up a little bit, and maybe I'm going to do it the right way. There we go. You see that bottle there next to it, that jar? That jar is a little over 2.5 ounces and has probably about 35,000 mustard seeds inside that tiny little jar. There's about 14,000 mustard seeds in an ounce of mustard seeds. So think about how tiny that is. And Jesus says, if you have that much faith, you can tell this tree to throw itself into the ocean and it'll do it. But what Jesus is trying to tell his disciples is, it's not about saying, oh, I have more faith than you, or I have some super huge faith. Even a tiny bit of faith is enough to do all the things that God calls us to. Even that little bit, that mustard seed sized faith, which I know all of you have, that God has given to you, you can do anything that God calls you to with that faith. There is no work that God will call you to that you can't do with a faith the size of a mustard seed or the faith that you already have. That faith in you that God has given you can do anything. You can accomplish anything that God calls you to, and all you need is that much faith. And that's pretty good, isn't it? And it's wonderful that God gives us this great gift of faith. And then Jesus says today, when that seed's planted in the ground, imagine what it can do. It can create this gargantuan tree from that tiny little seed. Or in other words, all the things God can do through you. When you say, well, what can God do through me? Whatever God wants to do. There is nothing so difficult that God will put you to do that you can't do. And when you do what God calls you to do, it grows and it grows. When you share your faith with one person and they get to know God's love for them, and then they share it with another and they share it with another, think of all the people that reaches. Think about this. Jesus came and he shared the good news of salvation for us. And he shared that with the disciples, and there were a dozen of them. And how many people have heard about Jesus now? How many billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of people have heard the good news and come to believe in God and know salvation through Jesus? All starting from one seed. All starting from Jesus. And then that seed of faith that was planted in disciples, just like this. Just a mustard seed sized faith that has grown and grown and grown over the years. Now, we're going to do a little experiment to show how adding just one little thing can change a lot of stuff around it. Hopefully it'll go well. I'm not as certain of my science on this one, but we're going to take a little demonstration to see how God can use a mustard seed, how God can use each of us to change the world, to make a difference in the world. Jesus talks about a mustard seed, how this little seed, the tiniest of all the seeds, creates this gigantic plant, this huge plant that even the birds of the air can make nests in. And sometimes we think, well, what can I do? I can only offer a little bit, or I can only do a little bit, or maybe I'm really young, like Solomon in the first lesson today talks about how he's just a child taking over his father's position as ruler of the people of Israel. And so he's asking God for wisdom. Well, Jesus says, this little seed that I put in you, this mustard seed, is enough to make this giant plant to do anything that I need it to do. Jesus says, I can use you no matter if you say, I have a lot, or I have a little, or I'm old, or I'm young, or I'm tall, or I'm short, or whatever I am. you have everything you need because you have God. The Lord is with you, and that's what we really need. That is the one in whom our faith resides, and if our faith is in Him, we know that we have enough. So I'm going to add a little tiny bit of something. You can see that jar over there has about a quart of liquid, and I'm going to put just a few ounces of a different liquid in there, and let's see what happens when we add just a tiny bit of one thing. Can it change that giant quart of liquid? Can just a couple ounces change a giant cup of liquid? Let's see what happens here. It is changing it. And it is changing it into a giant blob. They call this elephant toothpaste. Well, it's not quite as toothpastey as I thought it might be, but it definitely is becoming something other than what it was. It's made that little bit of toothpaste, or that little bit of liquid, changed all of that other liquid. And I do want to warn you at home, if you try to do this, it is what is called an exothermic reaction. In other words, it produces a tremendous amount of heat. So that liquid right there, that foam that's being created, that elephant toothpaste that's being created by adding just a couple ounces of basically yeast, which is really, really tiny as well. By adding that to it, it creates this reaction that gets to almost about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's hot enough it could burn you. So don't play in it, and only if you want to do this, make sure it's done with a parent present with you. But I think I have something that might even more dramatically demonstrate how just adding a little something like a mustard seed to our lives changes our lives, or adding it to the world changes the world around us. Okay, we saw that adding a little yeast to that other liquid changed all of it. You can still see that sitting there, that all the liquid pretty much in that container was changed by just a little bit of yeast. But I have a reaction here that I think will demonstrate that even a little bit better than that. There's that big bottle of soda there, and I'm going to add a little bit of candy, these Mentos, and we'll see how that goes. Because Jesus says that little seed of faith grows into such a giant thing, and we're going to see if we can make that happen right now, or at least a little demonstration of it. So we're going to add these in here, hopefully, somewhat carefully. And all I can put in there. And here we go. Ready? Watch! Well, not exactly what I expected. Kind of thought I'd do a little more. If we can get a few more inside there too. Well, I guess it goes to show you that sometimes the best ideas a person has don't always work out exactly the way you hoped it would. That wasn't much of the geyser I was expecting. You can see about half the bottle of soda went up, but not quite the way I was expecting it to go, but that's okay. We know that when God plants that seed in our lives, it changes our whole lives. That little bit of faith, the size of a mustard seed, changes everything in our lives. It changes the world around us. Even though maybe we didn't get a big geyser out of that, it definitely did have an effect, and it definitely did make a change. And we know that when you put your faith into action, when you live that mustard seed of faith, when you use whatever gifts you have at whatever age you are or wherever you're at, God uses that to build that kingdom bigger and bigger and bigger. And we thank God that He has given us that seed of faith.